For 9 months, a billionaire's son lived in silence, his voice stolen by trauma, his laughter buried in grief. Therapists failed, hope vanished, until a maid stepped into their mansion. What she did one stormy night would break the silence forever and reveal a truth no one was prepared to face. Before we dive into this unforgettable journey, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? If stories about love, sacrifice, and second chances speak to your heart, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we're bringing you another powerful story you won't want to miss. The rain slid down the towering windows of the Cross estate, each drop echoing the sorrow that had lingered inside its walls for nearly a year. Damien Cross, one of the most powerful CEOs in the city, sat alone in his study, the weight of silence pressing against his chest. His empire stretched across continents, his name commanded boardrooms, but here, in the vastness of his mansion, he was powerless. For 9 months, he had lived inside a house that was as quiet as a tomb. It wasn't always this way. The estate once carried laughter, footsteps that echoed up the grand staircase, and the soft voice of his wife, Julia, who had filled every corner with warmth. But that ended on a rain-soaked night 9 months ago, when twisted metal and shattered glass stole her life. Damien had survived, but Julia hadn't. And Ethan, his son, hadn't spoken a single word since. 7 years old, with wide eyes that used to sparkle with mischief, Ethan now moved like a ghost. He communicated only with gestures, a point, a nod, a shake of his head. Sometimes he scribbled small drawings, but most of the time he clung to silence, as if afraid that speaking would shatter what fragile safety remained. Damien had spent fortunes on therapists, psychologists, speech specialists, and even renowned nannies. Each promised progress, but after weeks, each one left, defeated by a boy whose grief ran too deep. Damien was a man who thrived on control. He could predict market shifts, dismantle rivals, and build alliances with a single phone call. But this, his son's silence, was the one battlefield where his power meant nothing. Every night he stood outside Ethan's door, listening to the soundness within, aching for the sound of his child's voice. The mansion itself seemed to mirror that emptiness. Its halls, lined with priceless paintings and chandeliers, felt cold and unwelcoming. Marble floors gleamed, but no one walked across them with joy. The dining table, long enough to seat 20, held only untouched meals and glasses of water. Wealth filled every space, but warmth was nowhere to be found. It was during this quiet collapse that Maria Alvarez arrived. She was not the polished professional that Damien usually hired. Maria came from a small, struggling neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. Her resume was modest, filled with housekeeping jobs and long hours in small apartments and hotels. She had no advanced degrees, no certifications in child psychology, no polished references from elite agencies. What she had was something far rarer: patience, humility, and a quiet strength born from hardship. Damien had resisted her hiring. "We've tried trained specialists," he told Mrs. Grant, the household manager. "If they couldn't help Ethan, how could a maid possibly do any better?" Mrs. Grant had been firm. "Because she doesn't see herself above him, sir. Sometimes children need presence more than expertise. And so, Maria arrived, stepping into the grand mansion with her simple suitcase and a heart both nervous and determined. She was in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back neatly, hands worn from years of labor, and eyes that carried shadows of her own unspoken pain. She had known loss, though she never spoke of it, and something in that experience allowed her to recognize the depth of Ethan's grief without flinching. On her first day, Maria wandered the silent halls, watching the boy from a respectful distance. Ethan sat curled up by a window, sketching faint lines on paper. Damien hovered nearby, arms crossed, skeptical. "He won't respond," he muttered. "Don't." Maria didn't push. She didn't kneel down with bright, forced smiles or bombard the boy with questions like the others had. Instead, she simply sat a few feet away, pulled a small notebook from her pocket, and began to draw quietly, herself. She never once looked directly at Ethan, but her presence was steady, calm, unthreatening. In its past, Ethan glanced sideways at her, his pencil stilled. Slowly, almost cautiously, he began to sketch again. Maria didn't react. She just continued her own lines, humming softly under her breath. A lullaby in Spanish, so soft Damien barely recognized it as song. By the time she stood and left the room, Ethan had drawn 3 more pages. It wasn't much, but for Damien, it was the first time in months his son had stayed with someone without shutting down completely. That night, Damien stood by the window of his study, staring out at the storm. He replayed the scene in his mind. He still doubted her. How could a maid with no training succeed where every professional had failed? Yet a quiet part of him, one he hadn't listened to in months, whispered that maybe, just maybe, Maria had brought something money couldn't buy. For Ethan, her presence was not a test or a treatment. It was simply human. And in that simplicity, something fragile had stirred. The days that followed unfolded differently than Damien expected. Maria didn't force routines on Ethan, nor did she carry the stiff detachment of past therapists. Instead, she wove herself gently into the rhythm of the household. She swept the marble floors, polished the silver, tended the garden, all while moving through the spaces Ethan inhabited without intrusion. She acknowledged him with small smiles, brief nods, but never pressure. She let him decide how close she could be. Ethan noticed. Children always notice. One morning, while Maria dusted the library shelves, Ethan slipped inside and sat cross-legged on the rug. He didn't draw or gesture, he just sat there, silent but not retreating. Maria continued her work, humming softly as she always did. For the first time, Damien, watching from the doorway, saw his son stay in the same room with someone for nearly an hour without retreating to his... Later that week, Maria placed a bowl of fresh fruit on the kitchen counter. Ethan wandered in, hesitant. He reached for an apple, but stopped halfway, looking toward her as though expecting a reprimand. Maria simply smiled and slid the bowl closer. "It's yours if you want it," she said softly. Ethan froze at the sound of her voice, then took the apple and scurried away. It wasn't a word, it wasn't even a sound. But it was trust, a seed planted. Damien couldn't ignore it anymore. Something about Maria unsettled him, not in a threatening way, but in the way she defied his understanding. "Why doesn't she demand?" he muttered one evening to Mrs. Grant. "Why doesn't she try harder?" Mrs. Grant smiled knowingly. "Because forcing won't heal him, sir. Sometimes it's the quiet ones who mend what shouting cannot." Maria's patience reminded Damien of Julia, and the thought both comforted and pained him. Julia had been warmth incarnate, her laughter filling the house, her hands always reaching for Ethan. Maria was different, so radiant, but her presence carried a steadiness that was slowly pulling Ethan out of his shadows. And yet, Damien wrestled with his doubts. He feared allowing hope to grow again. Every time a specialist failed, Ethan sank deeper into silence, and Damien blamed himself for believing. Could he endure another disappointment? Could he survive watching Ethan, with Maria's presence proved only temporary? Maria, unaware of his inner war, continued her quiet ways. She began to notice Ethan's drawings, sometimes left scattered across the table. She never commented directly but left fresh paper and pencils nearby, as if inviting him without words. One afternoon, she sat at the table and began sketching a bird. Ethan wandered in, clutching his notebook. Slowly, cautiously, he sat beside her and began to draw as well. They worked in silence, side by side, 2 souls speaking without sound. When Maria finished, she slid the page across the table. A bird in flight. Ethan studied it, then drew a smaller bird beneath it. For the first time, Maria allowed herself a smile of quiet triumph. Damien saw the drawing later. He stood over the table, staring at the 2 birds, his heart aching. It wasn't a voice, but it was connection. Something was changing, and for the first time in months, Damien allowed a flicker of hope to live inside him. That night, he found himself watching Maria from across the hall as she tucked Ethan into bed. She didn't fuss or lecture, she simply sat beside him, humming softly, until his eyes closed. Damien leaned against the doorframe, realizing that the mansion, long drowned in silence, was beginning to hum again. Not with words, not yet, but with presence, with patience, with something Maria could never have purchased. He whispered into the quiet, more to himself than to anyone else. Maybe this time will be different. And in the darkness of the mansion, Ethan stirred in his sleep, clutching the small bird drawing close to his chest, as though holding on to the first fragile thread of healing. The morning sun filtered weakly through the tall windows of the Cross mansion. painting long streaks of pale gold across marble floors that felt more like museum stone than part of a home. The silence that always lingered here was broken only by the soft shuffle of staff footsteps in the distance. Damian Cross's mansion looked perfect on the outside, but within its walls, silence ruled like a heavy chain that no wealth could break. Maria Alvarez walked carefully as she carried a basket of folded laundry. Every creak of the floor, every echo of her own step reminded her that sound here was not welcome. Ethan, Damian's 7-year-old son, reacted to sound as if it were an enemy waiting to pounce. Maria had noticed it almost immediately after she began work. When a door closed too firmly, Ethan flinched. When someone raised their voice, even to call across the hall, his shoulders stiffened and his small hands shot up as if bracing for a blow. The boy had not spoken for 9 months. No therapist, no doctor, no nanny had been able to coax out a single word. Yet Maria, with no professional training, began to notice what the experts had overlooked. His silence was not just refusal, it was survival. She adjusted her routines with quiet precision. When she dusted the heavy library shelves, she made sure never to let a book slam shut. When she carried plates from the dining room, she set them down so gently, the porcelain barely whispered against the wood. At night, she made sure the lamps in Ethan's hallway were never left off. Shadows unsettled him, turning his small body rigid as though he was reliving the night of the accident that stole his mother. Maria did not approach Ethan with questions or demands. She began with small gestures. She would leave simple paper drawings on his desk, a smiling sun, a little bird, a car with wheels far too big for its tiny body. Ethan never reacted immediately, but she noticed he didn't throw them away. The first drawing lingered on his nightstand for days. The second one she found tucked under his. In the evenings, she sometimes played soft music on a small old radio she had brought from her modest apartment. Gentle Spanish guitar notes filled the air, faint enough not to overwhelm, strong enough to weave warmth into rooms that had felt lifeless. Ethan never said a word, but once she caught him lingering outside the kitchen doorway, his head tilted as if listening. Bit by bit, her presence seemed to carve out cracks in the fortress of silence Ethan had built around himself. One afternoon in the garden, Maria carried a small basket of freshly picked herbs to the kitchen. She noticed Ethan walking several paces ahead of her, dragging his toy car by a string. His steps were small and hesitant, as if each one might betray him. When she paused, he paused. When she bent to tie her shoe, he stopped too, glancing back. It was not conversation, but it was connection. By the end of her second week, Ethan began sitting closer to her at meals. He wouldn't speak, but he didn't pull away when she poured juice into his glass or set an extra napkin beside his plate. His small hand brushed hers once, not by accident but by choice, and Maria felt the significance in her chest, like a spark of fire in winter. Damian saw it too. He often lingered at the head of the table, pretending to scroll through his phone, but his eyes betrayed him. He watched as his son leaned slightly toward Maria, as though her presence anchored him. Damian's emotions were tangled. Admiration because someone had finally reached his son, jealousy because he felt like an outsider in his own child's healing, and guilt because he had spent so much money on specialists while overlooking the power of simple kindness. He could not ignore the truth. His mansion was changing. One evening, a thunderstorm rolled in, shaking the walls with low rumbles of thunder. Damian sat in his study, his tie loosened, glass of whiskey untouched on the desk. The storm outside mirrored the one inside him. He remembered his late wife, her laughter echoing through this house, her gentle touch on Ethan's hair as she read bedtime stories. She would have known what to do, she always knew. But then he heard something that pulled him from his grief. The faint sound of Maria's voice humming in the hallway outside. He rose quietly and followed. She was kneeling beside Ethan's bed, her voice low and steady as she hummed an old lullaby. Ethan's eyes were wide, watching her closely, but he wasn't trembling like he used to during storms. Instead, his hand gripped the little paper bird she had drawn earlier that day. Damian felt his throat tighten. He wanted to step in, to hold his son, but his feet felt nailed to the floor. Maria's way was working, and it left him both grateful and raw with shame. The moment that broke the stalemate came on a Sunday morning. Damien was at the breakfast table, scanning financial reports with weary eyes, when Ethan shuffled in, clutching his toy car. Maria was already there, arranging plates of toast and fruit. She smiled at him gently. Without a word, Ethan walked over to her. His small hands trembled as he held out the toy car, then placed it carefully into her palm. For 9 long months, he had not initiated any act of trust with anyone. But now, in the quiet light of the dining room, he had given her his most prized possession, the toy his mother had gifted him on his last birthday. Maria's eyes softened, moisture gathering as she curled her fingers around the toy. She didn't speak, afraid words might shatter the fragile bridge he had just built. She simply nodded, as if to say she understood the weight of his gift. Ethan let out a shaky breath, then climbed onto the chair beside her, his small body leaning against her arm. Damien froze. The air in the room seemed to shift. His chest ached with emotions he could not name. It was as if a crack had opened in the mansion walls, letting in light after months of suffocating dark. He stared at Maria, who did not look up at him but continued buttering Ethan's toast with quiet care. Something about the sight pierced him. She was not just a maid, she was slowly stitching life back into a home that had been broken beyond recognition. For the first time in months, Damien realized he was not entirely alone. The following days carried a quiet transformation, noticeable in the smallest ways. Ethan began shadowing Maria as she moved through the house. If she went to the kitchen, he followed, clutching his toy car but no longer dragging it on the string. If she folded laundry, he sat near the basket, occasionally brushing a towel with his fingers as though testing the softness. Maria never pushed him, never demanded a word. She let him exist beside her, letting silence be shared rather than feared. That, she believed, was the difference. One afternoon, Maria set a chair in the sunlit garden. She hummed softly as she trimmed herbs. Ethan appeared, barefoot, toy car in hand. He hesitated at the edge of the patio, his eyes darting toward her. Maria looked up and smiled. She didn't call him over, but after a long pause, he approached and sat cross-legged on the grass nearby. She plucked a sprig of mint, handed it to him without a word. He sniffed it, wrinkled his nose, and for the first time in months, Maria saw the faintest flicker of amusement cross his face. From the second-floor window, Damien watched, his heart squeezed at the sight. Ethan had smiled, airily, but it was there. For a man who measured life in stock percentages and profit margins, this felt like the first real gain he had made in nearly a year. Yet admiration was not the only thing stirring in him. A shadow of jealousy crept in. Why her? Why not him? He was Ethan's father, yet it was Maria who had unlocked these small moments of life. The guilt dug deeper. He had tried with expensive gifts, private tutors, endless appointments with specialists. None of it mattered. It was the maid, the one person he'd hired without credentials, who was giving his son back piece by fragile piece. That evening, Damien cornered Maria in the hallway. His tone was sharp, harsher than he intended. "What are you doing with him?" Maria blinked, startled, clutching the stack of towels she carried. "Just being there for him, sir, that's all." Damien's jaw tightened. He wanted to accuse her of something, anything, but the sincerity in her eyes silenced him. He turned away, running a hand over his face. "I don't understand why he trusts you." Maria lowered her voice. "Because I don't ask him for what he can't give. I just accept what he offers." The words struck him harder than any reprimand. He left without responding, but her voice echoed in his mind long after. 2 days later, another moment sealed Maria's place in Ethan's world. The boy had been sitting by the fireplace, fiddling silently with his toy. Maria entered with a tray of cocoa, setting it gently on the low table. She sat cross-legged on the rug, sliding one mug toward him. Ethan's eyes darted to her, uncertain. Then, slowly, he set his toy car aside and reached for the mug. His small fingers brushed hers, and this time he didn't recoil. Damien entered quietly, just as it happened. He froze in the doorway, watching. Ethan took a sip, then set the mug down and shifted closer to Maria, his shoulder lightly touching hers. She didn't move, didn't make it dramatic, just continued sipping her own cocoa as if it were the most natural thing in the world. For Damien, the sight was both a dagger and a balm. A dagger because his son sought comfort in someone else. a balm because his son was finally reaching for life again. He swallowed hard, retreating before they noticed him. The true turning point came one gray morning when rain lashed against the windows. Damien was in his office, consumed with unread emails, when he heard laughter. Soft, breathy, but unmistakably laughter. He shot up, heart pounding, and followed the sound. There, in the hallway, Maria crouched on the floor, drawing silly faces on sticky notes with a marker. Ethan sat beside her, his lips curved upward, shoulders shaking in the ghost of a laugh. His small fingers clutched one of the sticky notes tightly. Damien's throat constricted. 9 months of silence, and though no words came, the sound of joy, so fragile, so raw, was returning to his son. Ethan looked up at Maria, eyes wide, and handed her his toy car again. Not just as a gift, but as if saying, "You are safe, you are mine." Maria accepted it with a tender smile, ruffling his hair gently. Damien stepped back, leaning against the wall, overwhelmed. His mansion, once drowned in silence, now held a fragile melody again. That night, Damien sat in his dimly lit study, his glass of whiskey untouched as always. He stared at the rain streaking the windows. He had spent millions on experts, but it was the maid who brought life back into his home. The thought unsettled him, not because it was wrong, but because it forced him to confront a truth he had long buried. Sometimes the greatest wealth lay not in money, but in human touch. For the first time in 9 months, Damien allowed himself to hope. The storm that threatened inside the mansion wasn't one of thunder or lightning. It was the quiet, brewing tension between appearances and truth, between what the outside world demanded of Damien Cross and what Ethan's fragile heart needed. Whispers spread among the staff long before they reached Maria's ears, but eventually they did. Soft words dropped like poison in the halls of marble and polished glass. "She's clever, that maid," one butler muttered while arranging fresh flowers in a crystal vase. "Winning the boys' trust so quickly, too quickly, it's almost—" Another maid, older and loyal to Damien's late wife, whispered back, "Mark my words, she's using the boys' grief. Mr. Cross might be blind now, but when he sees, it will end badly." Maria had learned to keep her head down, but she couldn't block out the sting of their voices. She wasn't here for gossip, for games, or for power. Every morning she tied her apron the same way she once did in her small neighborhood laundromat. Her purpose wasn't wealth, it was Ethan, the boy's wide eyes, the way his little hand had trembled when he first placed his toy car into hers. That was what kept her rooted. But Damien wasn't immune to the murmurs. His board meetings were increasingly filled with veiled remarks and side glances. "Your attention is slipping," one of his business partners told him after a tense quarterly meeting. "The company needs a leader, not a distracted father who spends his time chasing after a child who refuses to." The words cut deeper than they should have. Damien had always defined himself by control, by precision. Numbers didn't cry. Deals didn't wake in the night trembling from shadows. But his son did, and no empire, no balance sheet had taught him how to fix that. When Maria entered his office one evening to return a forgotten folder from the study, she found him seated at his massive mahogany desk, fingers pinching the bridge of his nose. Papers were scattered, untouched. His tie hung loose. She had never seen him like this. Disarmed. "Sir," she said softly, laying the folder down, "I thought you might need this." He looked up, and for the first time, there was something almost raw in his eyes. But then, his expression hardened, snapping the mask back into place. "Maria," he said sharply, "do you understand your role here?" The question startled her. "My role?" Confused, his voice rose, not with rage but with something heavier, disguised as authority. "Your staff, a maid. You're not his therapist, not his teacher, not—" He stopped himself, jaw tightening. "Don't overstep. You think a few drawings, a few walks in the garden can heal what trained specialists couldn't? You think you can just—" The accusation landed like a slap. Maria's hands trembled at her sides, but she refused to let him see her crumble. "I don't think I can fix him, Mr. Cross," she said, voice steady though her chest ached. "I just want him to feel safe." "You're making him dependent on you," Damien snapped. "When you leave, and you will, it will destroy him all over again." Her throat tightened. Maybe he doesn't need someone who leaves. Maybe he needs someone who stays. The silence after her words was deafening. Damien turned away, unable to meet her gaze. At night, Maria packed her small bag in her modest room at the far end of the mansion. She had endured poverty, loss, and loneliness, but she had never felt so unwanted as she did then. If the man who signed her paycheck didn't believe in her presence, what was she fighting against? But when she stepped into the hall, bag in hand, Ethan was there. His small figure stood by her door, eyes wide, trembling, his beloved toy car clutched in his fist. He didn't speak, but his body spoke for him. He pressed himself against her, tiny hands gripping her skirt as if to say, "Don't go. Don't leave me to." Her knees buckled. She crouched to meet his gaze, tears already spilling. "Ethan," she whispered, brushing his dark hair from his forehead. "I wasn't—" She choked on the lie. She was leaving. But now she couldn't. Not when this boy, mute for 9 months, was silently begging her to stay. Damien stood at the end of the hall, frozen. He had come to call Maria back, guilt gnawing at him since their argument. But the sight before him gutted him more than anything else could. His son, his little boy who hadn't clung to anyone in months, was holding on to Maria as though she were the last light in a dark world. And Damien realized, with shame burning through him, that his anger had been misplaced. He wasn't furious at Maria. He was furious at himself, at his helplessness, at the truth that no amount of wealth could heal what Maria's quiet prudence had begun to mend. He stepped forward slowly. "Maria?" His voice broke. "I was wrong." She looked up, eyes shining with disbelief and pain. He saw in them the reflection of his late wife's eyes, not in likeness but in depth. The same selflessness, the same stubborn strength. "Don't go," Damien said, the plea raw and unpolished. "Please, don't go." Her hands trembled as she smoothed Ethan's hair. "I only wanted to help him," she whispered. "You are," Damien admitted, his chest tight. "You're helping him in ways I never could." The words unlatched something in her. For the first time, she allowed herself to soften in his presence. She nodded, but she also spoke the truth he needed to hear. Helping him doesn't mean he'll heal overnight. It doesn't erase what happened. "No," Damien said quietly. "But if he can find even a sliver of peace with you here, then I'd be a fool to drive you away." For a moment, the air shifted. They weren't employer and maid, billionaire and poor woman. They were simply two broken souls, trying not to drown in the wreckage of loss. Maria swallowed hard. "I'll stay. For Ethan." Her choice wasn't made of wealth or promises. It was made of love, the kind born from scars. As the night deepened, the gossip of the staff continued to spread, but within the halls, where Ethan slept clutching his toy car, something else stirred. A fragile bond had begun to form between a grieving father, a wounded boy, and a maid who carried her own ghost. And though their worlds seemed destined to clash, wealth against poverty, control against compassion, it was in that fragile bond that the first threads of a family began to weave. The next morning, the mansion was quieter than usual. The staff moved briskly, whispers hidden behind polite smiles. Maria returned to her duties, but her eyes carried shadows of the night before. Ethan trailed her footsteps closely, as if afraid she might vanish at any moment. Damien, dressed in his sharp suit, paused at the top of the stairs to watch them. The way Ethan's hand brushed Maria's as she passed him a plate, the way he leaned toward her when the butler's voice grew too loud. It was subtle, but it was trust, and Damien knew it was something money had never bought. Yet outside those walls, the battle was growing. Damien's closest advisors began questioning him outright. At lunch in a downtown skyscraper, one man leaned across the table, voice low but sharp. "This maid you hired? It's all over the gossip pages. They're saying you've lost control, Damien, that you've let some poor woman worm her way into your house because your son is broken." Damien's jaw clenched. "Watch your words." "I'm only telling you what investors are whispering," the man pressed. "You're letting sentiment jeopardize everything. You're not thinking like a CEO." But Damien wasn't sure he wanted to think like a CIO anymore. Not when every instinct in him screamed that Ethan needed Maria, no matter what society thought. Back at the mansion, Maria tried to push through her own doubts. One evening, she found Ethan curled up on the floor of the playroom, silent tears streaking his cheeks as he clutched a photo of his mother. Her heart twisted. She sat beside him, quietly humming a lullaby her own mother used to sing. Slowly, Ethan rested his head against her arm. Damien entered the doorway and stopped. The sight cracked something open in him. His son, leaning on Maria, finding comfort in someone he had nearly driven away. Later, when Maria rose to leave, Damien caught her arm gently. "You said you lost someone too," he said softly. She stiffened. It wasn't a story she often told. "My little brother," she whispered at last. "He was 10. An accident. I was supposed to be watching him." Her voice shook. "I know what it's like to drown in guilt, to think, maybe if you'd been there, it would be different." Her confession hung in the air, raw and unvarnished. Damien's eyes softened in a way she hadn't seen before. "That's why you understand him," he murmured. Maria blinked back tears. "It's why I can't walk away." Their worlds could not have been more different. His built on skyscrapers and power, hers on survival and scars. Yet in that moment, the walls between them cracked. Days passed, and slowly, Damien began to see her not as staff, but as something more. Not a replacement for therapists or nannies, but as a lifeline. The mansion no longer echoed silence quite the same way. Ethan began to laugh quietly when Maria drew silly faces on napkins. He followed her into the garden, held her hand when thunder rolled outside. The staff still whispered, the business world still judged, but in the quiet corners of the Cross Mansion, a new truth was forming. Fragile, defiant, undeniable. Maria was no longer just a maid. She was the heartbeat the house had been missing. And though the clash of their worlds promised more storms ahead, it was clear Damien, Ethan, and Maria were no longer just fighting their battles alone. Together, they were beginning to stitch broken lives into something resembling family. The storm rolled in without warning, sweeping across the city with heavy clouds and sharp winds that rattled the glass panes of the Cross Mansion. Rain hammered against the wide windows, filling the hollow rooms with a sound that seemed to echo Ethan's silence. Relentless, restless, and unresolved. Maria was in the kitchen when she noticed it. The sudden flash of lightning brightened the halls, followed by a deep rumble of thunder that made the very walls tremble. Almost immediately, she heard hurried footsteps above her, the soft patter of a child running, not toward comfort but away from it. Ethan. Her instincts pulled her up the stairs before she had time to think. She found him huddled in a corner of his room, knees tucked to his chest, his little hands clamped over his ears as though he could block out the entire storm if only he pressed hard enough. His face was pale, eyes wide with terror, his small body shivering. Maria's heart broke at the sight. She had seen him scared before, at slammed doors, at raised voices, at sudden shadows. But this was different. This was the deep, trembling fear of a child reliving something no 7-year-old should ever have endured. She moved slowly, crouching down a few feet away. "Ethan," she whispered gently, her voice carrying a softness she had once reserved for her brother. "It's okay. You're safe." But the boy shook his head violently, pressing himself harder against the wall, as if the storm would swallow him whole. Maria knew words alone wouldn't reach him. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a steadying breath, and let memory guide her. When she opened her mouth again, it wasn't to speak but to sing. It was a lullaby, old, worn, simple, one her mother had sung to both her and her brother when they were children. A melody Maria had carried in her heart long after her brother was gone. Her voice was quiet, trembling at first, but the notes threaded through the air like fragile light piercing the dark. Ethan's trembling lessened, just slightly. His hands loosened over his ears, as if curiosity had forced a tiny gap between his fear and her song. Maria shifted closer, still singing, until she was within reach of him. She didn't touch him, not yet. She only let the melody surround them both. Another clap of thunder cracked across the sky, and Ethan whimpered, leaning instinctively toward her. That was when Maria extended her arms. He hesitated, then suddenly threw himself into her embrace, burying his face in her chest. She held him tight, rocking gently, her voice never faltering from the lullaby's rhythm. And then it happened. At first, Maria thought she had imagined it, just a soft sound lost in the storm. But then she felt it again, Ethan's lips moving against her shoulder, his voice hoarse and broken from disuse. One single word, fragile yet piercing. "Mama." Maria froze. Tears stung her eyes instantly, her throat tightening as the lullaby faltered for the first time. She pulled back, just enough to see him, his small face streaked with tears, his lips trembling from the effort. He had spoken. After 9 months of silence, he had spoken. The word hung in the air like a prayer answered, like a wound breaking open to let healing begin. Maria cupped his face with trembling hands. "Oh, Ethan," she whispered, her tears falling freely now. "You spoke." But Ethan clung to her tighter, repeating the word again, this time weaker, as though the storm inside him was draining out with every syllable. "Mama?" Behind them, unnoticed until now, a shadow lingered in the doorway. Damien. He had come searching for his son when he heard running footsteps, but what he found stopped him cold. His boy, his silent boy, cradled in the arms of a maid, whispering a word that should have been reserved for the woman they had lost. His chest tightened painfully, grief and relief warring within him. He wanted to cry out, to demand why fate had chosen this woman, to draw from his son what he himself could not. Yet at the same time, he wanted to fall to his knees in gratitude, to beg Maria never to leave, never to take that fragile comfort away. He stayed silent, unseen, torn between the past and the present. Maria kissed Ethan's damp hair, still crying softly. "It's okay," she soothed, rocking him as though he were much younger than his 7 years. "You're safe. I'm here." The boy didn't speak again that night, but he didn't need to. One word had shattered 9 months of silence, and it had been enough. When the storm finally passed, Ethan had fallen asleep in Maria's arms, his breathing soft and steady. She laid him gently on his bed, pulling the blanket over him with the tenderness of a mother who never stopped loving, even when love was stolen from her. She turned then, startled to find Damien in the doorway. His face was unreadable, his eyes shadowed with emotions she couldn't place. She quickly wiped her tears, lowering her gaze. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to overstep." Damien stepped inside, his eyes flicking to his son before returning to her. His voice was low, strained. "You didn't overstep." Maria nodded, unsure, waiting for the reprimand that never came. Instead, Damien ran a hand over his face, as though trying to steady himself. "He spoke," he said at last, the words breaking with disbelief. "I heard him." Maria swallowed, her throat thick with emotion. "Yes, just one word, but it's a beginning." Damien's gaze lingered on her, heavy and conflicted. "He called you Mama?" The words sliced through the air between them, heavy with meaning. Maria felt her chest tighten, guilt and gratitude entwining. "I know," she whispered. I didn't mean for it to happen. He was so afraid. And the song, it reminded him of safety, of his mother perhaps. I'm only a shadow of what he lost." But Damien shook his head, his eyes dark. "No. You gave him something I couldn't. Do you realize that? Months of doctors, therapists, specialists, all the money in the world, nothing worked. And then you—" His voice cracked, raw with grief. "You brought him back." Maria lowered her gaze again, her hands trembling. "I only tried to love him. That's all." The room was thick with silence, broken only by Ethan's steady breaths. Damien turned away, staring at his son as if seeing him anew. He felt pride, sorrow, jealousy, all tangled until he no longer knew which belonged where. His boy had found his voice again, but only in the arms of another. At night, Damien barely slept. He lay awake in his study, replaying the scene over and over. The storm, the lullaby, the word. Mama. It felt like both a miracle and a wound. In the following days, the change was unmistakable. Ethan began to whisper more. Not often, not loudly, but words came slowly. Sometimes a request, sometimes a name. But always, it was with Maria. He called for her in the mornings. He reached for her hand in the garden. At mealtimes, he sat closer to her than to his father. It was as if Maria had become his anchor, the one safe harbor he dared trust with his fragile voice. For Damien, the sight stirred everything he had tried to bury. Admiration for Maria's patience, resentment that his own son trusted her more than him, guilt that perhaps he had been too cold, too broken to reach the boy when he needed him most. And something else, something dangerous, a tenderness he had no right to feel for the woman who was slowly mending his son's soul. One evening, as Maria was tucking Ethan into bed, Damien lingered at the doorway once again. He watched her brush the boy's hair back, whispering words of reassurance. She sang softly, the same lullaby, her voice a balm. Ethan, half asleep, murmured, "Stay, Mama." Damien's breath caught. He turned away quickly before Maria could see his eyes, burning with unshed tears. That word was no longer just a crack in Ethan's silence. It was a crack in Damien's heart, forcing him to question everything he thought he had locked away. His wife's memory, his grief, his loneliness, all collided with the undeniable truth that Maria had become something more than just a maid in his home. But he was not ready to face it, not yet. For now, he allowed the fragile miracle to unfold in silence. Ethan was speaking again. That was enough. Yet, as he walked away from his son's door, Damien knew deep inside that nothing would ever be the same again. The morning sun filtered through the mansion's tall windows, golden light spilling across the marble floors. For once, the Cross estate seemed alive. Laughter, small, hesitant echoes from the garden where Ethan and Maria sat together, the boy holding a sketchbook while Maria guided his hand in soft strokes of color. It was a picture of a house, simple and childlike, but bright. For months, the house had been dark in his drawings. Just today, Maria had convinced him to color the windows yellow, as though light had finally returned. Neither of them noticed the shadow beyond the hedge, the flicker of a camera lens catching the scene. By afternoon, Damien's phone vibrated relentlessly on his desk. His assistant stormed in, pale with alarm, holding a glossy tabloid already rolling across the city. Splashed on the cover was Ethan, clutching Maria's hand, his face half buried in her skirt. The headline screamed, "Billionaire's Maid, the boy's new mother." Damien snatched the magazine, his chest tightening, his chest burning. The images inside were merciless. Maria pushing Ethan on a swing, Maria kneeling beside him, her hand wiping a tear from his cheek. To the world it looked like intimacy, like a story too delicious to resist. To Damien, it felt like an invasion, but worse. It was a narrative he could not control. The media descended like vultures. Paparazzi parked outside the estate gates, drones buzzed overhead, and online forums exploded with speculation. Some praised Maria's tenderness, calling her a savior to a broken child. Others were vicious. "She's clearly angling for his fortune. The maid knows what she's doing. Men like Cross are easy prey when their hearts are shattered." That evening, Damien sat across from Maria in his private study. His tie was loosened, his face weary from a day of calls with his public relations team, lawyers, and furious board members. He stared at her, not with anger, but with something far heavier. "Do you have any idea what they're saying out there?" His voice was low, but edged with steel. Maria flinched. "I saw. I didn't mean for this to happen. I never wanted—" "You never wanted," Damien cut in, rising from his chair. "My company is under siege. Partners are calling, questioning my judgment. They're saying I let a maid replace the professionals, that I've lost control. Not just of my household, but of my empire." Her throat tightened, her eyes glistening. "And what about Ethan? Has anyone stopped to think about how this feels for him?" He's finally smiling again. "Don't lecture me about my son," Damien snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. The room vibrated with his fury, though beneath it was a crack, a plea he could not voice. Maria's lips pressed together, her trembling hands clutching the edge of her skirt. "I would never hurt Ethan. Never. I only wanted to give him comfort where no one else." Damien's breath caught, guilt prickling at the base of his throat. He knew she was telling the truth, but the storm outside had begun to seep inside, and the staff whispers hadn't helped. Gossiping in hallways, guards murmuring at the gates. To them, Maria was a scandal in the making, one that could sink them all. The breaking point came days later. Damien was summoned into a boardroom filled with icy stares and restless murmurs. His most senior partners circled like predators, their words slicing through the air. "When this is a liability, Cross. The press is painting a picture of instability. Your son is fragile. Do you really think parading him with some maid is wise? Sell the mansion if you must. Remove her. Do whatever it takes, but control the narrative." Each word dug deeper. They spoke of Ethan as if he were a chess piece, not a boy. They spoke of Maria as though she were a stain. Damien sat motionless, torn between the empire he had built with his own hands and the fragile hope Maria had brought into his home. When he returned to the mansion, Maria was in the hallway, her face pale, eyes downcast. She held a small suitcase in one hand, a folded note in the other. Damien froze. "You're leaving?" Maria's voice was hushed, trembling but resolute. "I can't stay, Mr. Cross, not when my presence brings shame to your family. They call me a gold digger, a manipulator. I can't let Ethan suffer more because of me." The note slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the floor. Damien bent to pick it up, his eyes catching the first words. "For Ethan, with love." His chest constricted. "Maria," he began, but the words faltered. His pride clashed with his desperation, his fear with his need. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that the whispers didn't matter. But before he could, the sound of small feet echoed across the marble. Ethan stood at the top of the staircase, his eyes wide, his face streaked with tears. His gaze dropped to the suitcase in Maria's hand, then to her trembling frame. For the first time in 9 months, his voice rang out, not a whisper, not a murmur, but a cry that shattered the silence of the mansion. The words pierced the air like lightning. Maria froze, her heart lurching into her throat. Damien turned sharply, eyes wide with disbelief. The boy's voice cracked, raw and desperate, but strong enough to echo through every corner of the house. Ethan stumbled down the stairs, his small arms reaching, his sobs breaking through years of silence. "Don't go! Maria, please, don't leave me!" Fear sickness quick from Maria's grip as tears blurred her vision. She rushed forward, gathering Ethan into her arms. His body shook against her chest, but his voice was alive, louder than it had ever been. Damien stood frozen in the doorway, every part of him unraveling. For months he had prayed for this moment. He had begged the silence to break. And now, here it was, not with him, not because of him, but because of the woman he had nearly driven away. The storm outside rattled the windows, thunder cracking across the sky. But inside the mansion, another storm raged, one of truth, of love, of realization. Damien's fists unclenched, his pride collapsing beneath the weight of his son's. "Don't go," Ethan whispered again, his small hand gripping Maria's blouse, as though she were the only anchor he had left in a world that had taken everything from him. Maria looked up at Damien, her face streaked with tears, her eyes searching his for permission, for understanding. And for the first time, Damien Cross, billionaire, widower, untouchable CEO, felt utterly powerless, not because of money, not because of business, but because of love. The storm had broken, and nothing would ever be the same again. Maria sank to the floor with Ethan still in her arms, her fingers brushing his hair as though he were made of glass. She whispered soothingly, rocking him while her own tears fell freely. This was no longer about jobs or reputations. It was about a boy who had finally found his voice and the woman who had given it back to him. Damien's breath caught in his chest as he watched. Every defense he had built, the armor of wealth, the cold shell of authority, cracked wide open in that moment. His son was speaking again, begging, pleading, not for his father's attention, but for hers. "Even," Maria murmured softly, pulling back just enough to look at his tear-streaked face. "I wasn't leaving you. I was just trying to protect you." "Stay," Ethan croaked, his small hands clutching tighter. "Please stay." Her heart shattered. She had thought her leaving was an act of love, a way to shield him from scandal. But Ethan had shown her the truth. He didn't need protection from rumors. He needed her presence, her warmth, her care. Damien stepped forward slowly, his voice low, almost hoarse. "Maria, I was wrong." She turned her head, meeting his gaze. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with something she had not seen before. Humility. "I let them convince me you were a risk," he continued. "That you were taking advantage of us. But the only risk here is losing you. Losing what you've given Ethan." Maria shook her head, torn between relief and sorrow. "The world will keep talking, they'll keep pointing fingers at me. At us. Can you live with that?" Damien looked at his son, still clinging to Maria, as though the mansion itself might swallow her if he let go. For 9 months, Ethan had lived in silence. For 9 months, no price, no therapy, no amount of money could reach him. And now, because of her, he had broken through. "The reason I left you," one of your grandpa's interest informs, soaked with tears, with one eye shut. "You are alone," Damien said hastily, forgetting to. The thunder outside seemed to soften. Rain pelted gently against the windows as though the heavens themselves exhaled. Maria's tears flowed anew, her grip on Ethan steadying. She had expected rejection, dismissal, an end to the fragile trust she had built. Instead, she saw Damien cross, powerful, feared, respected, lowering his guard and choosing his family above his empire. Ethan hiccuped softly, his voice cracking but insistent. "Stay, Maria. Don't leave me." Maria pressed her lips to his temple, whispering, "I'll stay, I promise." In that moment, the scandal ceased to matter. The headlines, the boardroom arguments, the venomous gossip of staff, all of it dissolved into nothing compared to the sound of a boy rediscovering his voice. Later that night, when the mansion was quiet again, Damien found Maria in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She looked exhausted, her eyes swollen, but there was a strength in her posture that humbled him. "I owe you an apology," he said softly, leaning against the counter. "Not just for doubting you, for forgetting that this house isn't just mine. It's Ethan's too, and if he sees you as family, then so do I." Maria's throat tightened. "I never wanted to replace anyone. I only wanted him to feel safe again." You didn't replace," Damien said, his voice firm, almost reverent. "You healed?" For the first time in months, a fragile smile touched her lips, and Damien, standing in the glow of the kitchen light, realized that the storm outside had not destroyed them. It had revealed what truly mattered. The world might keep its whispers, the tabloids might keep their poison, but inside the Cross Mansion, the silence had finally been broken. Not by money, not by power, but by love. And Damien vowed silently that he would never let it fall into silence again. The sky over the Cross Mansion groaned with thunder, the kind that made the windows tremble in their frames. Rain streaked across the glass like tears shed by the heavens themselves. Damien stood at the tall windows of his office, staring out into the storm. For months, he had hidden behind numbers, contracts, and board meetings, pretending control. But tonight, the mask felt unbearable. His son was asleep, finally breathing easy after a day of laughter, thanks to Maria. And Damien knew the truth. She had given back what he had failed to protect. He clenched his fists, pacing. His chest felt too tight. He thought of Maria's quiet resilience, her hands guiding Ethan through shadows of fear, her voice soft enough to break through silence. The tabloids had painted her as a schemer, but Damien had seen her heart, her tears, her selflessness. And for the first time since his wife's death, he wasn't afraid of feeling alive again. He was terrified, yes, but alive. The storm seemed to call him. Without waiting for reason, Damien strode through the hallways until he found Maria in the kitchen, folding napkins with trembling hands. She froze when she saw him, clearly unsure whether he would send her away for good. But instead of words, he simply nodded toward the staircase that spiraled to the rooftop terrace. Maria hesitated. Her fingers brushed the fabric of her apron, as if clinging to something familiar. Yet when she met his eyes, she saw no accusation there, only a raw plea. She followed him up, each step echoing like a drumbeat in her chest. When they pushed open the heavy door, the wind slapped against them, carrying rain that soaked their clothes in seconds. The rooftop was wide, lined with stone balustrades, and overlooked the sprawling gardens that shimmered under flashes of lightning. Damien stepped into the open, the storm lashing his hair against his forehead, his suit clinging to his frame. Maria stayed near the doorway, arms wrapped around herself, until he turned. His eyes, dark, piercing but trembling with something softer, pulled her forward. "Maria," his voice cracked, barely audible over the thunder, "I can't keep this inside anymore." She froze, breath trapped in her chest. "You don't have to explain anything. I know the world is against me. I know I don't belong here." But Damien shook his head fiercely, rain dripping from his jaw. "No, that's not what I mean. I've been a coward, hiding behind anger, behind control. For 9 months, I told myself I was enough for Ethan, that my wealth could buy him healing, and every night I watched him slip further into silence." His voice faltered, but he pushed on. "You brought him back, Maria, with nothing but patience, with kindness. You gave him his first word. You gave him laughter again." Maria's lips trembled. She wanted to speak, to tell him it was only her duty, that anyone with a heart would have done the same. But the truth pressed heavy. She had given Ethan pieces of her own broken heart, and it had healed them both. Damien stepped closer, his eyes glinting under a flash of lightning. "I've been terrified," he admitted. "Terrified that, if I let myself feel something for you, it would betray my wife's memory. Terrified that my son would think I'd replaced her. But I see now, it's not about replacing, it's about building something new. Something stronger." Maria gasped softly. The rain blurred her vision, or maybe those were her tears. She shook her head, whispering, "I'm just a maid. I don't belong in your world. People already hate me for being here. What happens to Ethan if—" Damien's hand cut the air, not in anger, but in urgency. "Don't you see? Without you, there is no world for me. Without you, my son falls silent again. Without you, this mansion is nothing but stone and shadows." Her body shook, not from the cold, but from the weight of his words. Her heart longed to believe him, yet fear clung to her ribs. Could she truly stand in a place once occupied by his wife? Could she hold both love and loss in the same fragile hands? Damien stepped closer still, the storm wrapping around them like a witness. His voice lowered, hoarse with sincerity. "I'm not asking you to replace her, Maria. I'm asking you to stand with me now, in the storm, and help me build a home where my son smiles again. Where you smile too." Rooftop seemed to pause. Even the rain softened for a heartbeat, as if waiting. Maria searched his face, every line etched with grief and hope, every shadow pulled forward by the flicker of lightning. He wasn't just a billionaire now. He wasn't a master, and she wasn't just a maid. They were two broken souls standing on the edge of something terrifying and beautiful. Her lips parted, a whisper trembling out, "Damien?" But the rest was stolen when he reached for her, hands trembling as if afraid she would vanish. Their eyes locked, questions colliding, fears unraveling. And then, in the downpour, his lips met hers. The kiss was desperate, raw, filled with months of unspoken pain and longing. Rain plastered her hair against her face. His hand cupped her jaw, as if anchoring her, and she clung to his soaked shirt like he was the only steady thing in the storm. From the balcony below, small eyes watched. Ethan stood in his pajamas, tiny hands gripping the railing, rain splashing onto his cheeks. But he wasn't afraid. For the first time in 9 months, he smiled, truly smiled. His lips parted, and in a voice cracked but sure, he whispered into the storm, "Papa's happy." And somehow, in that fragile moment, the mansion wasn't hollow anymore. The kiss lingered, deepening with the roar of thunder around them. When Damien finally pulled back, his forehead pressed against Maria's, his chest heaving. The storm could have drowned out the world, yet in that space between them, silence reigned. Her eyes shimmered with tears, her lips trembling, as if caught between surrender and retreat. He whispered, "Say something, anything, even if it's no." Her throat worked, words choking against the tide of emotions. Finally, she breathed, "I don't know if I'm strong enough. I don't know if I can bear the whispers, the accusations, the weight of your world." Damien's hand cupped hers, grounding her. "Then let me carry it with you. You've carried enough burdens alone. Let me share this one." Maria's gaze darted away, across the drenched gardens below. Memories of her brother flickered. His laughter, the night of the accident, the lullaby she had sung to calm his fear. She had failed to save him. Could she risk failing Ethan too? As if sensing her turmoil, Damien pressed on. "Maria, You once told Ethan shadows don't win when someone holds a light for you. Don't you see? You are that light. For him, for me. Her breath hitched. The words pierced through walls she had built, walls of guilt and self-doubt. Slowly her hand tightened around his. Not a full surrender, not yet, but an acknowledgement that she wasn't walking away. Below them, the storm raged, but up here, something fragile had taken root. Damien pulled her closer, wrapping his arm around her as if shielding her from more than the rain. He whispered into her hair, "We'll figure it out. The world can wait. Right now, it's just us." Maria closed her eyes, letting the warmth of his embrace seep through the cold. For the first time since stepping into this mansion, she didn't feel like an outsider. She felt. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the balcony below. Ethan had disappeared inside, but the echo of his whispered words lingered in Damien's chest. Papa's happy. Simple, innocent, yet profound. His son had seen what even he had struggled to admit, that happiness was possible again. Damien pulled back just enough to look at Maria. Her soaked hair clung to her cheeks, her lashes heavy with rain, but to him, she had never looked more radiant. Not polished, like the socialites at his galas, but real, alive, unafraid to stand in the storm. He said softly, "I don't care what they say tomorrow, or the day after. Let them call it scandal. Let them print their lies. They don't know you. They don't know us." Maria shook her head, voice fragile. "Damien, they'll say I'm using Ethan, that I'm using you. I couldn't bear it if it hurt him." Damien's jaw tightened. "Then we show them. Not with words, but with love. They can't twist what's real." A silence stretched between them, heavy but not suffocating. Maria's fingers rose, brushing against his cheek, tracing the stubble roughened by rain. "You make it sound simple?" His lips curved, a rare softness breaking through his usual steel. "Because sometimes, the hardest things begin with something simple. Like a kiss in the rain." Her laugh broke through, shaky but genuine. For months, she had buried her joy, too afraid to let it bloom. Yet here, on this rooftop, amidst thunder and accusation, something within her cracked open. Their lips met again, slower this time, not desperate but deliberate, a promise rather than a plea. Maria melted into it, letting the storm carry away her fears, if only for this night. When they finally parted, Damien rested his hand on her shoulder, guiding her toward the door. "Come inside. You're freezing." But Maria paused, turning back toward the rain-swept gardens. "Thank you," she whispered. He frowned slightly. "For what?" "Seeing me. Not as a maid, not as a scandal, but as me." Damien's throat tightened. He wanted to say more, to tell her she had saved him as much as she had saved Ethan, but words felt too small. Instead, he kissed her temple and led her inside, where warmth awaited. That night, as the storm rolled across the sky, the mansion was no longer a hollow cage of wealth. For the first time since tragedy had claimed it, the halls breathed with something new, hope. And in Ethan's quiet dreams, laughter returned, carried on the echo of his whispered truth. Papa's. The days after the rooftop confession unfolded with a mixture of fragile hope and looming tension. For the first time in months, Damien Cross allowed himself to breathe without the weight of constant guilt pressing against his chest. Ethan was speaking again, hallowing, but enough for the mansion to echo with something it had not known since his late wife's passing. The sound of life. Maria Alvarez had become more than a maid. She was the thread weaving a broken family together, though the outside world was not ready to accept her place. Damien understood this better than anyone. His reputation had always been tied to his empire, his strength in the boardroom, his ability to command respect with a single glance. Yet now, his private life was spilling into headlines, and the story was not one he could control with contracts or corporate power. The tabloids lingered on every photograph, circling his home like vultures. Maria was painted as a schemer, a gold digger, a fragile-looking woman who had somehow managed to capture the loyalty of a billionaire's son. The cruelty of those words tore at her more deeply than she let on. One morning, Damien walked into the sunlit breakfast room, finding Maria already there with Ethan. She had drawn little faces on the corners of his pancakes with syrup, and Ethan giggled as he pointed at one, whispering something Damien couldn't catch. Maria leaned close, her expression gentle, coaxing him to repeat himself. "Happy?" Ethan whispered again, his voice still small but clear. Damien froze. The word lingered in the air, heavier than any speech, carrying with it a promise he had feared would never return. Maria glanced up, meeting Damien's eyes across the table. She offered a soft smile, as though silently reminding him that these small steps were victories worth more than business deals. For the first time, Damien crossed the room without hesitation, placing his hand on Ethan's hair, ruffling it gently. "Yes," he said hoarsely. But happiness was fragile, and the world outside was relentless. That afternoon, Damien faced another confrontation in the marble-lined halls of his company's headquarters. 3 of his longest-standing business partners waited for him in the conference room, their faces carved with disapproval. "Be distracted, Damien," one of them began. "The markets are watching. Investors are uneasy. This situation in your personal life is destabilizing." The woman in the green suit sighed. Damien narrowed his eyes. "My personal life has nothing to do with the company's performance." "The contrary," another countered sharply. "You're not just a man. You are a symbol. A symbol of stability, discipline, control. But now, the newspapers are full of photographs of your maid, Damien, and the boy clinging to her as if she's already replaced your wife. People are asking questions." The words were daggers meant to wound. Damien's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening against the polished table. "If they want to ask questions," he said coldly, "then let them ask. But no one questions Ethan's healing. And no one disrespects Maria in my presence again." The partners exchanged uneasy glances. They had expected resistance, but not this level of conviction. One of them muttered, "You're gambling everything on her." "I'm not gambling," Damien replied. "I'm choosing my son's future over your approval. If that's a problem, you know where the door is." When the meeting ended, Damien's heart thundered, but his resolve held firm. Protecting Maria was no longer a choice, it was a necessity, as natural as breathing. Back at the mansion, Maria could sense the tension in him. That evening, as they crossed paths in the hallway, she paused. "They said something again, didn't they?" Damien stopped, caught off guard by her perceptiveness. For a moment, his instinct was to shield her, to deny it. But Maria's gaze was steady, unafraid. She had faced whispers all her life. "They think you're a liability," he admitted quietly. "They think you're after something." Maria lowered her eyes, her fingers tightening against the tray she carried. "That's what people like them always think, that someone like me doesn't belong. That kindness must have an agenda." Her voice trembled, but there was a strength beneath it, forged in years of being underestimated. Damien stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. "I don't care what they think. I know who you are. Ethan knows who you are. That's what matters." Maria blinked back the sting of tears, nodding once. She wanted to believe him, yet the doubt lingered. Could love survive the scorn of an entire world that saw her as nothing but a servant? The answer came in the most unexpected way. That night, at dinner, the mansion's dining room seemed to hold its breath. The long table, usually too grand and too silent, had 3 simple plates at one end. Maria sat beside Ethan, cutting his vegetables into small pieces, while Damien watched them both with a softened expression he didn't often allow himself to show. Halfway through the meal, Ethan set down his fork. He glanced between Maria and Damien, his lips moving in hesitation. Then, with a quiet determination, he spoke. "Mama." The word hung in the air like a bell tolling in a cathedral. Maria froze, her eyes wide, her hand trembling above the plate. Damien's chest constricted, his throat tightening with emotions he could barely contain. Ethan repeated it, firmer this time, reaching to touch Maria's arm. "Mama?" Maria's breath hitched. She wanted to correct him, to tell him she wasn't, couldn't be, not really. But the look in his eyes was so pure, so full of trust and love that she could not bring herself to deny him. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she pulled him into her arms, whispering, "I'm here?" Damien swallowed hard, every instinct in him torn between grief and gratitude. For months, he had dreaded the day Ethan would call someone else that sacred name. Yet now, seeing his son cling to Maria, hearing his laughter bubble through tears, Damien realized this was not a replacement. It was healing. A bridge between loss and hope. Later that evening, when Ethan had been tucked into bed, Maria lingered in the hallway outside the boy's room. Damien approached slowly, his footsteps measured, his expression unreadable. "He called you Mama," he said quietly. Maria flinched. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't encourage it. He just..." Damien held up a hand, silencing her. His eyes softened. "I know, and I don't want you to apologize for it. He chose that word. He gave it to you. It means he's finding his voice again. For that, I'll always be grateful." Her breath trembled, relief flooding her. Yet beneath the relief was fear. Fear of what tomorrow would bring, when the world outside their walls continued to question her place. The trial was not over, but within the mansion's heart something unshakable had begun to take root. The following week brought storms of a different kind. While the sky above the city was clear, the whispers swirling through the elite circles were anything but. Lavish dinner parties, charity galas, and polished gatherings buzzed with Damien Cross's name, each sentence dripping with disdain or "Have you heard?" one woman murmured over a glass of champagne. "He lets a maid sit at his family's table. A maid, of all things. Can you imagine?" "Disgraceful," another man agreed. "A man of his stature could have any woman. Instead, he chooses someone who polishes his floors." The sneers traveled faster than any stock report. It was inevitable that Maria would hear them. One afternoon, while she accompanied Ethan to a private children's clinic for his therapy session, a cluster of society wives passed her in the hallway. Their perfumes trailed like invisible daggers, and their smiles were sharp as... "Isn't she the one?" one whispered loudly enough to be heard. "The maid who thinks she's mistress of the mansion?" Maria kept her gaze low, her hand firmly wrapped around Ethan's. The boy clung to her, sensing the tension. Every word sliced through her composure, but she refused to let her expression falter. Ethan's fragile courage depended on her steadiness. That evening, Maria sat alone in her room, her heart heavy with doubt. She had never asked for this life. She had only wanted to care for Ethan, to see him laugh again. But now, the walls of the mansion seemed to echo with accusations she could not silence. When Damien found her, she was seated by the window, her shoulders trembling. He crossed the room without hesitation, kneeling before her. "Tell me." She shook her head quickly, wiping her tears. "It doesn't matter. I'm fine." "Maria," he said firmly, tilting her chin up until her eyes met his. "I can see when you're breaking. Don't hide it from me." Her lips quivered before the words spilled out. "They'll never accept me. To them, I'll always be the maid. I'll never be enough for Ethan, for you, for this world that wants perfection." Damien's jaw clenched, his eyes blazing with fury, not at her, but at the cruelty surrounding her. "You are enough, more than enough, and let me be clear, my family is not this world. It's not the critics, it's not the investors, it's not the sneering voices. My family is Ethan. And you? That's all that matters." Maria's tears fell freely then, but this time they carried relief. Damien drew her into his arms, holding her as though shielding her from the storm outside their walls. "They can say what they want," he whispered into her hair. "I'll spend every day proving them wrong." Their resolve was tested again when Damien received an invitation to a prestigious fundraiser, a gathering he could not decline without raising suspicions. The glittering ballroom was filled with chandeliers, string quartets, and the sharp eyes of those waiting to dissect his every move. Damien arrived with Maria at his side. The room fell into a hush, like predators pausing before deciding whether to strike. Maria wore a modest yet elegant gown, her posture graceful though her hands trembled slightly against Damien's arm. Ethan remained at home under the care of a trusted nurse, but his spirit seemed to walk with her, giving her the courage to strike tall. As they crossed the floor, Damien's voice was low and steady. "Look at me, not them. Always me." Maria nodded, her pulse pounding. For a moment, the whispers returned, louder than the music, but Damien silenced them with his actions. He introduced her to business partners, spoke of her with respect, and never once let go of her hand. At one point, a wealthy heiress approached, her smile dripping with false sweetness. "Damien, darling," she purred. "What a surprise! And who is this lovely, lovely companion?" Damien's grip on Maria's hand tightened. "This is Maria Alvarez," he said clearly, his voice echoing with steel. "The woman who gave my son back his laughter. The woman who has my respect, my gratitude, and my loyalty." The heiress blinked, taken aback by his candor. The crowd murmured, scandalized yet intrigued. In that moment, Damien had drawn a line in the sand, daring anyone to cross it. When the evening ended, Maria exhaled deeply as they stepped outside. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured. "Yes, I did," Damien replied, helping her into the car. "I will do it again, as many times as it takes. They need to understand you're not a shadow to be hidden. You're the light that pulled us out of darkness." The following days proved his words true. The backlash continued, but Damien no longer flinched. He gave interviews, spoke openly about Ethan's progress, and credited Maria's influence without hesitation. In the mansion, the changes were even more profound. Ethan no longer shrank from voices or footsteps. He played in the garden, his laughter ringing like music. He sat at the dinner table and told simple stories, his vocabulary growing stronger each day. One evening, he proudly announced, "Mama taught me," while holding up a drawing of a sun. Maria's heart clenched at the word, but Damien only smiled, his hand brushing hers beneath the table. There was no correction, no hesitation. For Ethan, the word mama meant safety, and that was a gift neither of them would take from him. The trials had not ended, but within those walls, trust had become their anchor. The three of them sat together, night after night, the long table no longer lonely, but alive with laughter. Even the servants noticed, whispering among themselves about how the mansion had changed. Where there had once been silence and sorrow, there was now warmth. One evening, as rain tapped against the windows, Damien leaned back in his chair, watching Maria feed Ethan a spoonful of soup, while the boy giggled. His chest swelled with something he hadn't dared to name for months. Peace. For the first time since tragedy struck his family, he felt as though he could see a future again. After Ethan was tucked into bed, Damien found Maria in the kitchen, tidying dishes. He placed his hand gently on hers, stopping her. "I want you to know something." She looked up, curious. "You are not here because you're a maid," he said. "You're here because you've become the heart of this family, and I will never let anyone take that from us." Maria's breath caught, her chest rising with a rush of emotion she couldn't contain. "Damien?" But he silenced her with a gentle touch to her cheek, his eyes unwavering. "No more doubts, no more fear. We're in this together, always." Maria nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling into her heart. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps love could grow in the ashes of loss, and that trust could stand even against the storms of the world. That night, as the mansion lights dimmed and the city hummed in the distance, the fragile family that society tried to tear apart found strength not in approval, but in unity. And within the laughter of a child and the quiet promises of two souls, a new story was being written, no rumor could erase. The seasons shifted, carrying with them a quiet transformation inside the mansion. What was once a hollow fortress of marble and echoes had grown into a place where laughter belonged. Time had become their ally, healing wounds in ways no physician could have predicted. Ethan's voice grew stronger, his stutter softening into confidence, his silences breaking into stories that tumbled out with excitement. Maria's presence infused every corner with warmth, while Damien, once a man walled behind duty and grief, learned to live not by reputation, but by love. It was a sunny afternoon when the moment arrived. The garden behind the mansion was bathed in light, its roses blooming with colors so vivid they seemed almost unreal. Ethan darted across the grass, his small feet kicking up leaves, his laughter floating like music. Maria knelt near a fountain, holding out her arms as he ran back to her, crashing into her embrace with all the enthusiasm of a child who no longer feared the world. Damien watched from a distance for a moment, his heart swelling at the sight. He had attended countless board meetings, signed contracts worth billions, face-down rivals who thought themselves untouchable. Yet nothing, not a single achievement, matched the meaning of watching his son run freely into the arms of the woman who had restored them both. "Squatch me, Mama," Ethan squealed, tugging Maria's hand before darting toward the garden path again. Maria laughed, chasing after him, her dress flowing like a ribbon in the breeze. When she caught him, the two collapsed into a patch of grass, giggling. Damien joined them, lowering himself onto the ground beside them. Ethan immediately scrambled into his lap, clutching his father's shirt with one hand while pointing toward Maria with the other. "Daddy, Mama says I'm faster than her now." Damien raised his brows playfully. "Is that so? Well, I think Mama let you win." "Did not," Ethan argued, crossing his arms with exaggerated seriousness. "I'm big now. I can run faster." Maria smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "He's not wrong. He's stronger every day." Demille looked at her then, really looked, the sunlight catching the curve of her cheek, the kindness in her eyes. It wasn't just Ethan who had grown. It was all of them. The man who once thought his life was bound to sorrow now felt himself standing at the edge of something greater, something permanent. As Ethan climbed down to chase a butterfly fluttering nearby, Damien reached into his pocket. His fingers closed around the small velvet box he had carried for weeks, waiting for the right moment. He had planned speeches in his mind, rehearsed words that could capture his feelings. Yet now, as he watched Maria help Ethan cup his small hands around the butterfly before releasing it into the air, Damien realized no script was needed. He rose to his feet, his heart pounding. Maria turned toward him, her brow furrowing slightly at his expression. "Damien?" He took a step closer, then another, until he stood directly before her. Slowly, he lowered himself onto one knee, the grass cool beneath him. Ethan stopped chasing the butterfly and froze, his wide eyes darting between his father and Maria. Maria's breath caught, her hand lifting to her mouth as Damien opened the velvet box, revealing a simple but elegant ring that gleamed in the sunlight. It wasn't only to her that he spoke. His gaze shifted to Ethan, whose small hands fidgeted with excitement and uncertainty. "This isn't just for her," Damien said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "It's for you too, Ethan." The boy tilted his head, confused but listening intently. Damien's throat tightened, but he pressed on. "Maria has given us both something no amount of wealth or power could buy. She gave us hope, she gave us laughter again, she gave us family. So today, I'm asking not just her, but you as well." His voice trembled as he looked at them both, father and son vulnerable together. "Will you let us be a family? Will you both say yes to building a life with me, not as pieces bound by duty, but as hearts bound by love?" For a moment, silence hung in the garden. Then Ethan's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of a joy so pure it seemed to light his whole face. He stumbled forward, throwing his arms around Maria's waist. "Yes," he cried. "Yes, Daddy. Yes, Mama. We're family now." Maria's tears spilled freely as she bent down, cradling Ethan in her arms, her shoulders shaking with emotion. She looked up at Damien, her voice breaking. "Damien, I don't know if I deserve this. I never imagined—" "You deserve more than I can ever give," Damien interrupted, his voice steady, though his own eyes glistened. "Maria, I thought I had everything, wealth, reputation, control, but none of it meant a thing until you came into our lives. You showed me that a home isn't built by walls or riches, it's built by love, and you've given us that." Maria's hand pressed against her chest, overwhelmed. "When I first came here, I only wanted to help Ethan. I never expected this, never expected to be seen, to be wanted, to be loved." Damien reached for her hand, kissing the back of it reverently. "You are loved, by him, by me, completely, endlessly." Ethan tugged at Maria's arm eagerly, looking at the ring still shining in the box. "Say yes, Mama, please say yes." Maria let out a shaky laugh through her tears. She looked at Damien, then at Ethan, then back at Damien again. Finally, she nodded, her voice soft but unwavering. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Ethan cheered, clapping his hands together before hugging both of them. Damien slipped the ring onto Maria's finger, his hands trembling as if sealing not just a promise, but a destiny. He rose then, drawing her into his arms. Ethan squeezed tightly between them. "I love you," Damien whispered against her hair. "I love you," Maria replied, her voice trembling but certain. "Love you, Mama." "Love you, Daddy," Ethan added, his small voice completing the vow. The three of them held each other there, in the heart of the garden, the sun casting golden light over their embrace. For the first time, the mansion no longer loomed as a monument of loneliness, but stood as a home alive with laughter, warmth, and love. The moment stretched, timeless and sacred. It was not the culmination of a fairy tale, but the beginning of something real. A family reborn, not by chance, not by wealth, but by choice. The weeks following that afternoon in the garden carried a kind of lightness none of them had known before. The mansion, once cloaked in a quiet tension, now echoed with Ethan's laughter, Maria's gentle humming, and Damien's steady voice calling them in for dinner. It was as though the walls themselves had exhaled after years of silence, welcoming the change that had settled within. Maria's ring sparkled modestly on her finger, but to her it was brighter than any jewel in the world. Every time she caught sight of it, her heart tightened with gratitude and disbelief. She hadn't been born into wealth, hadn't been raised to imagine ballrooms or silk gowns, but the ring reminded her that love had chosen her, even when the world told her she wasn't enough. Damien noticed the way her eyes softened when she looked at it, and though he never said it aloud, the sight filled him with a quiet pride. He had faced criticism since announcing his intentions toward her. At business gatherings, whispers followed him. Why her? Some sneered. A maid, others scoffed. But Damien no longer measured his life by their approval. His gaze always returned to Ethan's steady smile, to Maria's warmth, to the undeniable truth that his heart had found its home. One evening, they sat together at the long dining table that had so often felt like a symbol of distance. In the past, Damien had eaten meals alone at one end, while silence filled the space. Now, Ethan sat between them, chattering animatedly about a storybook Maria had read to him. And then the dragon said, "You cannot pass." But the knight was brave, like Daddy, and he saved the princess. Right, Mama? Maria smiled, nodding. Yes, Ethan, very brave, just like your daddy. Damien chuckled, glancing at her. I'm not sure about slaying dragons, but I'll take the compliment. Ethan laughed so hard that milk nearly spilled from his glass. Maria reached out, steadying it before it tipped over. She glanced across the table and her eyes met Damien's. In that moment, without words, they both knew the same truth. They weren't three individuals bound by circumstance anymore. They were family. After dinner, they often walked together in the gardens. Ethan loved running ahead, pretending the hedges were enchanted forests, while Maria and Damien strolled hand in hand behind him. Sometimes Damien would tell her stories from his childhood, how he used to hide in these very hedges, how his late wife had once loved the roses. Maria listened quietly, never judging the past he carried. She didn't try to erase it. Instead, she offered him something new, the freedom to remember without being trapped in grief. One particular evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with streaks of orange and violet, Damien stopped walking. He looked at Maria, then at Ethan, who was gathering wildflowers a few feet away. His voice came low, steady, but edged with vulnerability. Do you ever wonder, he asked, if the world will forgive us for choosing this, for making a life that doesn't follow their rules? Maria paused, her hand tightening around his. She had wondered. Late at night, when the house was quiet, she sometimes feared their love would always carry the weight of judgment. But standing beside him now, she found her answer in the strength of his gaze. I don't need the world's forgiveness, she said softly. I only need yours, and Ethan's. If we are together, nothing else matters. Damien exhaled, as though her words had unlocked something deep within him. He leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Then, together, we will face whatever comes. Ethan bounded back to them with a fistful of flowers, interrupting the moment. Look, for Mama, he declared proudly, shoving the bouquet into Maria's hands. Maria knelt, overwhelmed by the gesture. They're beautiful, sweetheart, thank you. Damien bent down as well, brushing Ethan's hair back from his forehead. And for Mama's wedding bouquet someday, perhaps. Ethan's eyes widened in delight. Yes, Mama can carry flowers and I can carry the rings. Maria laughed through her tears, clutching both of them close. The days unfolded gently, with each one layering more proof of the bond they had built. Ethan began sleeping through the night without nightmares, his confidence growing as he started lessons again. The staff, who once viewed Maria with skepticism, now treated her with respect. Not because Damien demanded it, but because her kindness had touched them too. The mansion's energy shifted. Rooms once closed off were opened, and music often drifted through the halls when Maria played softly on the old piano. The turning point came on a Sunday afternoon, when the three of them ventured beyond the mansion's gates together. They attended a local fair in town, something Damien had never considered before. For once, he walked without bodyguards, pressing at every side, holding Maria's hand while Ethan clutched a balloon in his small fist. People stared. Some recognized him, whispering about the billionaire who dared walk among them so casually. Others noticed Maria, perhaps remembering her from humbler days. Yet instead of shame, she felt strength. Damien's hand around hers was steady, and Ethan's smile was fearless. For the first time, Maria believed she truly belonged at his side. Ethan tugged them toward a small carousel. "Ride with me, Daddy. Mama, come too." Damien hesitated, unaccustomed to such simple joys. But Maria gave his hand a squeeze. "Go on," she whispered. And minutes later, the three of them circled around on painted horses, Ethan squealing with delight as Maria laughed freely beside him. Damien watched them both, the wind lifting Ethan's hair, the sunlight catching Maria's laughter, and he realized he had never been happier. Not at a gala, not in a boardroom, not even at the pinnacle of his success. Happiness had been waiting here, in the ordinary, in the love that money could never buy. When the ride ended, Ethan jumped down and tugged at Damien's jacket. "Daddy, this is the best day ever, you know why?" Jan Wolf asked, crouching down to meet his son's eyes. "Because I have a mama now," Ethan said simply. "And I have you. That means I have a real family." The words struck Damien's heart with such force that his vision blurred. He pulled Ethan into his arms, holding him tight. Maria bent down, wrapping them both in her embrace. Damien whispered, "A real family. Forever." That night, as they returned to the mansion, the place felt different. The gates didn't close them in as prisoners of wealth. They welcomed them as guardians of love. Ethan ran ahead into the halls, and his laughter carried upward into every room, filling the home with a music more powerful than any symphony. Damien and Maria lingered at the entrance, looking around the place that had once been cold stone and empty echoes. Now it pulsed with life. He turned to her, his hand brushing her cheek. "This house was never truly alive until you walked in," he murmured. Maria's eyes softened, tears welling. "And it will never be empty again." Together, they stepped forward, hand in hand, toward a future that no longer belonged to duty or reputation, but to the rebirth of love. The mansion stood tall, but it no longer seemed imposing. Its walls carried the sound of their laughter, its halls bore witness to their healing. Within its embrace, a new story had been written, not of power or wealth, but of a family reborn. And as the night settled, the stars above shone brighter than ever, as though the universe itself had chosen to bless the vow they had sealed in the garden, the vow they would carry forward into every tomorrow. Love, hope, and family. Forever.